Vicki, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
So super excited to have you on the show. We were just kind of talking back and forth about how I came across you, and some of our clients and people that are on the show are part of Tugboat, which is about long-term businesses. And then someone had posted about the presentation you had given, and then I was like, oh my gosh, who's this Vicki? And then I went and I saw your book and I saw your research. I'm like, oh my gosh, does this fall right in line with the passion of me and the show? And you talk about century-old companies,
Yeah.
and I had listened to a couple of your podcast interviews that you'd done in the previous with previous people, and just I find your research super interesting. So for the listeners not familiar with you or your background, just give us a little bit of a where did you come from, how did you get involved in
Okay.
this topic, and how did you go about your research?
Sure. I found out after I started this research that every company I'd ever worked for is over 100 years old.
That
but
was afterwards.
I found that out afterwards. Yeah. So it
Oh,
wasn't my initial intent to do that. It
no
just
way.
turned out that that was the case. I was very fortunate as a young woman in the 1970s to begin my professional career with General Electric in a management position. And it was a time when most women started as administrative assistants or clerks or secretaries. I really appreciated the fact that it started my professional career at a whole different level than it might have been otherwise. And I spent 5 years at General Electric. I learned a lot, but one of the things I learned is it just wasn't a really good fit for me. A very large company with multiple locations. I was in human resources at the time, and you couldn't do anything without checking with New York first because they didn't want you to set precedent, and it was all very prescribed. So after 5 years, for a number of reasons, I made the switch to what was then a little company called Herman Miller. Probably heard of them. They're very famous for their modern furniture and office furniture. At the time, they were mainly in office furniture, and I just loved working at Herman
That's super
Miller. I
cool.
spent over 20 years there. I started out in human resources. Eventually was vice president of marketing, was in new business development, and actually started their retail business, which has really taken off in the last year, as you might expect, in
Yeah.
terms of home offices and especially seating. And ended up my last 5 years there, I was on the executive team in charge of strategy and chief of staff, and learned a lot of really positive things about what a business could be when I was at Herman Miller. The one quote that I always remember from DJ Dupree, who was the founder of the company, this was actually written on a plaque that was posted on the entry to their main factory. And it says, "A business is rightly judged by the quality of its products and services, but in the end, it must also face judgment as to its humanity." And they very much ran and still run the company with that thought in mind. They've been a participative management organization since the 1950s because, again, DJ believed that every worker should have a say in his decisions affecting his or her job, and that when the company was successful, that employees should share in the rewards. So there was a bonus system in place for decades, even by the time I started there. So just a lot of really interesting things that I learned about business. And I decided, I don't think it was a midlife crisis, but as I was approaching my 50s, I decided that I really wanted to spend the rest of my professional career teaching young college students who wanted to go into business and try to form their ideas about what a business could be. And that there were more things to think about than just the economics of business. If you wanted to not only feel good about the work that you did, but that the other people in the company and the customers and the community around you. And I was very fortunate to join a the faculty of a small liberal arts college, and I loved teaching. It was so great to be around young people and hear their ideas and answer their questions. But it was soon made clear to me that if I wanted to be a real professor and not just a visiting executive in residence, that I needed to do research. And I did what it seems like every former business executive feels they need to do. My first writing was all about leadership, my ideas on leadership. And I called it the everyday leader, if you will. And actually was quite successful in getting published in both academic journals and popular business press, but realized that wasn't really a research agenda. Once I said what I had to say, that was kind of it. I dabbled in international business for a while because I'm very interested in other cultures and other countries. Was able to get a Fulbright scholarship along the way to teach in Poland. Talk about learning something. Try teaching an executive MBA class on change management to people who are trying to manage their company from communism to capitalism.
Yeah, that's a whole, that's like, I wonder if there's above and beyond a PhD.
It was amazing. Reading the projects that they prepared was a whole education in and of itself. But I didn't happen on this research on 100-year-old companies until I led our school's Japan May term. And it was while we were visiting our sister university in Tokyo, called Meiji Gakuin University, where we listened to a number of lectures from professors there. And one of the economics professors, Makoto Kanda, gave a lecture on shinase. And shinase is the Japanese term for long-lived companies or traditional company in good standing. And some of these companies that he studied were 1,000 years old. I mean, they have a lot of very old companies in Japan. And when he started describing the characteristics of these companies and the practices that they had in common, I just became fascinated and came up with all kinds of questions in terms of, is it just a cultural thing? Would I find the same practices in the US? How many companies over 100 years old were there in the US? And so once, all these questions started rolling around in my mind, I realized I'd found a research agenda and spent the next 10 years working with Mako on research, both in the US and Japan, trying to answer those questions about common practices of companies that are over 100 years old.
I love it, Vicki. Oh, and I love it because you went out and you actually did the research for a decade. So just to kind of throw out there, because I want to unpack what you found in the research, and I think the listeners, you're bringing a quantitative perspective to things that I've been talking about for years on this show. And so I have had the CEO of Conscious Capitalism on the podcast, and I've had Bo Burlingham, which is a small giant. So there's these I shouldn't say lingering, there's these topics of be small and be a small giant, what does that mean? And then understanding that, or understanding conscious capitalism, where they talk about the 6 stakeholders. And then I got done listening to some of your material. I'm like, you essentially in your research have proven that what these other people are talking about is legit, and it works. And it works for 100-year-old companies, because you have to do so many things right to be around for 100 years.
Yeah.
So how did you approach this studies? And maybe I don't know if necessarily even how to unpack it, but what are the main characteristics? Yeah. If you were to, and you probably introduce your research in a certain way,
right,
so go for it.
Well, I'll tell you first a little bit about the process we went through, because I think, to me anyway, it was important that it be good, statistically sound research. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the reasons that I worked with Mako in Japan, because with his economics background, he could make sure we stayed on solid ground from the statistics piece of it. And academic research, you always start with a literature review of what other people had done. And interestingly enough, I mean, some of the books I'm sure you've heard of, Good to Great, The
Hmm.
Living Company, a lot of research with good information. But what we discovered is that it was all done on very large, publicly owned companies. And as a result, the data sets were small. And whenever you have such small data sets, it's hard to draw statistically significant conclusions.
Hmm.
And the fact that the majority of companies in the US and Japan and the world are small to medium sized privately owned companies.
Right.
So it
Totally.
wasn't real clear how much relevance that other research had to most of the companies that are in operation today. So we wanted to make sure that our research would be useful and helpful to someone starting a business or someone leading a business today that wanted to seek to last a long time or just to be a good business because obviously you wouldn't be around 100 years old if you hadn't done something right. So
Right. And
part of it
what I
was,
mean, it's what I'm so excited about. What you just said is it's useful and relevant because it's mainstream, right? So you're not like everybody is spending so much time talking about the unicorns who are raising money or the public companies. And like it's just a whole different set of rules necessary. Well, the game is just different. So you actually went in and said, hey, here's what privately held companies that have been around for a century have done.
yeah. Yeah.
So what
So
go for it.
easy to say, harder to do, I will say. I wore out several student researchers trying to pull together the database of US companies that are over 100 years old. Public ones were easy to identify. You got that handful, but okay, we know already they're not the standard. So to try to identify the privately owned 100-year-old companies took a lot of work. Some states have Century Club companies. I bless those governors for doing that because that was the one way of getting a list. But then you still had to vet them to see are they still in operation, et cetera, et cetera. Some industry organizations have Century Club
Mm,
companies. Interestingly enough, the lumber and building industry is a famous one, and there are a
I
lot of
bet.
small to medium-sized lumber yards and building supply companies that are small and over 100 years old. Agricultural co-ops, there are many of them. And then one of the things I really am sorry to see is so many local newspapers that have gone out of business because they are the ones that would write articles about companies in their town that had,
Hmm.
achieved the 100-year mark or the
Oh, I suppose. Yeah,
125-year
yeah.
mark. And they profile them in the newspaper. And so we'd find those articles online. And so, gradually, year after year after year, I was finally able to build a database in the US that was large enough to do the research. While we were building the database here, we were actually doing the research in Japan because the government there has a ready-made database of companies over 100 years old. And they're very compliant in answering surveys that college professors might ask them to do. So we started by doing case studies of, I think it was 24 100-year-old companies in Japan to come up with what they said were their common practices. Then we sent the survey to several hundred companies over 100 years old in Japan to see which ones they agreed with, came up then with a list of practices that they all said led to their survival as a company. Then we sent that same survey to all companies in one ward in Tokyo. It was over 7,000 companies, both old and young, in order to see
Whoa.
which practices were unique to the old companies. And then we took that same survey and by then had the database in the US and was able to send it to companies in the several hundred companies in the US and to see if the responses were culturally significant or if in fact they were the same. So as a result of all this, we were able to come up with statistically significant practices that the 100-year-old companies engage in, that yes, they self-report that they felt they led to their success, but it also seemed true when we compared them to practices of younger companies. And 100-year-old companies in the US were just as likely to engage in those practices as were companies in Japan. Because the pushback that I always received at academic conferences, in particular when I presented the research on Japan, was they would say, oh, that's just a cultural thing. There was all around the 1990s, I think it was, there were books published about, Theory Z and Japanese business management. And they were saying, oh, yeah, that's a cultural thing. You won't find the same thing in the US. And in fact, we did. And
That's
on
awesome.
many of the practices, the US companies were even more adamant about, yes, this is what it takes to survive for 100 years. So it was very rewarding, even though it took a long time, to see that everything was in fact reinforced. Some of the practices were the same as what the previous research had shown of large public companies, but there were a lot of other things that were quite unique, as you might expect for as a privately owned small to medium-sized business.
So there's a couple different ways that whatever direction you want to go is, I want to unpack for the listeners what are some of the characteristics in general of the Century Club, but also then, Vicki, well, how does Japan and the US compare? And then there's public and private. So there's a lot of probably sub ways that you're slicing the data in that, but maybe I don't know if you usually start from the top.
Yeah, I usually start by saying, okay, there were 63 practices that we identified in the research, and I consolidated those into 5 what I call factors. And these 5 factors were ones that were similar across the board, US and Japan, private, mostly in the private companies and the small to medium-sized companies, but also there were some public companies in the research as well. So the common factors were, the first one was a clear sense of mission and a strong culture to go along with that. And the unique thing that came up, and I'm sure this is because so many of the companies were private and small to medium size, they were adamant about the mission not being financially stated in financial terms, if you will.
First, at least, right? It's like a byproduct.
Right. It was like, and don't get me wrong, these are very profitable businesses, or they wouldn't have lasted for 100 years. But they tended to look at profit as the result of doing what they do and doing it well. One CEO said, we see profits as the fuel for our organizational engine, not our destination. They were an automotive supply company. You might have expected.
No. Oh, but I love it though. It just shows that. Yeah, I got so many. It just proves what the conscious capitalism movement's doing.
Right. So anyway, the first factor, a number of different things were included in that, but basically having a strong sense of purpose. Why are we in business? What do we do and why are we in business and why does it matter? And then the culture that forms around that, very strong culture, and making a point of, this is how we do things around here. These are our values. This is, what's important, that how you get things done is just as important as what you do. The second factor was all around core competencies and key strengths and how they managed those core competencies over time. Core competencies is an academic term. That's not necessarily the term that these companies would use. They would talk about their strengths, their secret sauce, if you will. Some of them literally had a secret sauce.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a key technology or a way they do business, some processes that they had. that they felt were unique to them and was what made them successful. The interesting thing is the young companies we surveyed also felt they had some certain core competencies. The difference was how the old companies managed them over time, and that they were very careful, clear about investing in those core competencies over time to keep them up to date. They didn't rest on their laurels. They were always trying to improve on their strengths and their competencies, and making the most of them in saying, where do we need to improve? How do we need to improve? I think it was Peter Drucker who said, a company doesn't need to grow in order to survive, but it must improve. And
Ooh,
so,
I like that a lot.
the kind of stereotype of an old company as some kind of musty old dinosaur that, doesn't change is totally wrong. They wouldn't be around if they hadn't found a way to change and adapt to the times. I mean, you're talking about, world wars, depression, recession,
you name
they've
it,
had
right?
other global pandemics they've had to live through, it's just all the things they've managed to overcome. They wouldn't still be here if they hadn't found a way to change appropriately and improve. And I think it's that change appropriately that came out clear in the practices that went along with this particular factor.
If I could say one comment on that, Vicki,
yeah.
when I was listening to one of your other pieces, you had mentioned in that dialogue that they actually took a while to change, which
Yes.
I found was intriguing, right? So like they did it, but it wasn't like they're not constantly breaking things.
And that was one of the practices. They said that we take a long time to make major change. Some said it, apologetically, but it was because they take their time when making a change that they're able to change successfully.
Mhm.
So they make a point of explaining the reason for the change to employees and helping them understand why they need to change. That will help you change. We'll invest in, whatever new technology you need to learn. But new people might be coming in too to help this happen. But we're all in this together. As I said, they don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They make a clear effort to bring everyone along, including customers and vendors and suppliers, and so it's that the time and care they take with understanding what needs to change, why it needs to change, explaining it, communicating it, and then preparing for the change to make sure they've got the capabilities to do it. So it's a very, very careful balance of tradition and change, and that they've managed to weather and figured out how to do it. I've had, one of my mentors was Roger Martin, who's written a number of books on strategy and design thinking. And he said that's the most difficult factor of the 5. Is
Really
trying to figure out how to balance tradition and change, and to make positive change successfully. And
interesting, yeah. Well, because you have this like level of uncertainty that you have to manage with everybody. No one can predict the future, so it takes a lot of. And I don't know if it gets into the other 3 factors, but where to do what you just said, you can't have this dictator, authoritative, top down, style. You have to eliminate your ego, and it has to be, it's just a way different approach. Otherwise, it's just
these companies don't say things like, which I have heard from some leaders, the train's leaving the station, you're either on it or you'll be left behind. They say, the train's going to be leaving the station and we want you on it. And here's what we need to do to make sure that we can all get on and be successful in reaching the destination. It takes time. It's not easy, and it's not always successful either. I mean, these companies have all had crises that they talk about, but the crises become stories for how to be successful in the future. They don't shy away from it. They said that one didn't work out the way we thought it would, but here's what we learned from it, and here's how we'll do things differently in the future.
That brings us to number 3.
The last 3 actually factors all have to do with relationships. And this is where, when I was presenting at academic conferences, I'd run into trouble, because there'd always be some finance professors in the back of the room that were like, wait,
Wait a
that's all
second.
soft stuff. How can you, say this? And it's like, it might be the soft stuff, but it seems to be what really, really matters, in terms of an organization living and being successful for a long time. The first of the three relationships was that the companies have really deep relationships with their business partners. And they're real partners. When you talk about customers or dealers or suppliers, outside influencers, that they really see them as partners in their business. It's not just an economic exchange. It's a relationship that they want to build over time. And so many of them had long-term customers, many of them had long-term vendors and suppliers, outside influencers, whether it's designers or dealers that have been with the organization for a long time. And when you have that long-term relationship, it becomes, they really did view them as extensions of the company, not, some outside entity. And it's a reason why, even though many of them were small to medium-sized businesses, they could continue to thrive, because they had, all these tentacles out that help support the business. They would, I heard so many stories about, we found most of the ideas for new products from customers. Many of the new technologies that we implemented came from our suppliers, who said, I think you might be able to to use this, and then kind of working together to figure out a way to make it happen. And it was because of the trust that's built in that true partnership that they're willing to exchange strategies and information and technology, and then they're all of them are successful over time.
What a
And it's
concept,
not
right? I just love it.
I know.
And I say that because it's just like, to me, Vicky, it's just such like a duh. But then you
Yeah.
go, okay, well, why doesn't it happen? I mean, like, trust in relationships, of course, right? And how many people do you think in the last 12 months realized how messed up their relationships were when their supply chains got completely
Yeah.
thrown a wrench in it, and they realized that all the people that didn't treat that well over the last 5, 10 years, they now are relying on, as people are making priorities and decisions of where things are going to go. I mean, yeah, you have to rely on others.
Yeah, and there are already stories coming out in the last year about how, customers have helped save our business and
Mhm.
things like that that wouldn't happen otherwise. There's just this kind of mutuality, I guess, that develops that over time, that it's we're all in this together,
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
thing. And it's fun to hear and see happen, and that it can happen. I had one CEO say, this whole idea of it being more of a relationship than a mere economic exchange. He said, I prefer covenants over contracts. He said, I just really want to see that, mutual relationship, whether it's with a customer or a supplier, or, that, we have this commitment to each other.
And maybe this is, I don't, because I want to make sure we go back to the last two, but like, where did this start in these companies? Because like over 100 years, the compound effect of little tiny bits of like behavior can, you walk in and you go, well, of course, look at this successful company. But at some point, somewhere, whether it was a leader or some crisis, somewhere they determined that relationships and trust and this we're in it together is something that we have to hold on to.
Yeah.
Where did you see that in the journey of the 100 years?
It often started with the founder, but not always. Sometimes it came out of a crisis in the company where they realized they weren't going to survive unless they changed and did things differently. But it's part of that culture that I mentioned in the first
Mhm.
factor, that that somewhere along the line, often often from the founder, there was this idea of this is how we do business. And that it's not just, the owner of the company having a relationship with the owner of the customer company or the supplier. We want everyone in the
Mm-hmm.
company to build those relationships with your peers in the, with our business partners. So, it could be,
It's a
engineer
mindset.
to engineer or finance person to finance person. That's the kind of relationships we want you to have. And that's built into the culture and becomes an expectation of the
Super
company.
interesting. All right. So the last one, the last
the
two.
second or the second relationship factor, or the fourth overall
I've
factor,
got it.
is, as you might expect, long-term employees. The employees in these companies tended to be with the company the length of service far, far longer than in the average organization. And in many companies, you saw generational families in the company. My daughter works at Herman Miller. It's that kind of thing that happens. They see, their parents or their grandparents working for a good company, and they do the same. And so there's so many benefits that come with having long-term employees, especially if you invest in their continued growth and development. There's this organizational knowledge and history that comes with, they can figure things out a lot quicker often. They don't have to reinvent the wheel every time some problem comes up, and as long as as part of the culture is a willingness to change and be open to new ideas and an investment in training and development, this whole idea of long-term employees and low turnover. The turnover rates in these companies is, less than half of the normal in the U.S. And so you think of all the money they save on, having to recruit and train new people.
Oh, for sure.
It just is amazing. But this doesn't just happen. A lot of these companies had policies and practices in place that were very employee-centric and treated employees, well, as I mentioned with Herman Miller and the participative management plan. Many of them had bonus systems in place or profit sharing, a lot of, kind of employee ownership programs of some sort.
Yeah, I was going to say, I want to make sure I don't go off on that because I want you to complete, and then I want to go back to some of the.
And the idea of seeing employees as whole people, not just a pair of hands to do what needs to be done for the company. That, these are people with families and part of their community, and, have talents that they outside of work that they may not necessarily be using at work, but recognizing the whole person. And as a result, many of the employees in these companies talked about the company as if it was theirs. As if they owned the company, even if their name wasn't, on the door. It was, they felt that sense of ownership and belonging, I guess is the best way to put it. And then the fifth relationship was one that I'm particularly happy to talk about because it was one that didn't come up in any of the previous research that was done, because all the research was done on large public companies. And that is the deep relationship that most of these companies have with their community. They invest in their local communities. They're the ones that support the Little League and the, PTA and, all of the, development and beautification projects for their community. So, they invest in their company. And for many of them, I think it stemmed from, their family name, wanting to be seen as, having a good reputation. But then it became wanting to be seen as a good citizen, as a company. And then it becomes wanting the community to be attractive in order to attract new employees and to keep people. And over time, it just becomes one with the community, where the companies want to invest in the communities will do whatever they can to keep the company there and keep it.
Self-reinforcing, right? I
So
mean,
it's all reinforcing, and then you get suppliers that will move nearby in order to be a better supplier, and so that helps the economic health of the community. And it just was, like I said, this reinforcing mutual benefit that it started out without any ulterior motive other than wanting to be a good community member, but as a result everyone benefited. What a side practice that we identified actually after the research was over was that many of these companies are also very environmentally aware and invest in a lot of sustainability practices. And in retrospect, that seemed to make sense because that's part of their community. And they know if they're going to be around for a long time, they want the earth to be healthy, their water supply, their wood supply, whatever it is that they use as part of their company. It made sense that they would be concerned about the environment, as defining that as part of their community that they want to have a good relationship with.
so awesome how you quantified what they've done. And I'm curious, Vicky, with all your research and all the time you've spent on this, when you think about like all the people you've met and encountered and interacted with, like, is there a couple moments that are very memorable to you where you were able to say, like, wow, these people beat all odds? And it's a good example of what you've pulled out from your research and how they were able to overcome it. I don't know if you got a couple right on them.
Oh, there's several. A couple of them I've mentioned before. There was actually one CEO I interviewed before I wrote the book, and asked him to look through the results of the research and see if he thought it was spot on. And he reads through it. He nods his head. He goes, "Yeah, I think you've got it pretty good, but I just don't think you emphasize relationships enough." Enough. Yeah.
Right.
Um, there was one thing that I did not mention. It was one of the practices way back in factor number one in terms of purpose and culture. Part of the culture, since the companies crossed all different industries, you might expect that their culture and their purpose were varied as well. One thing that was in common, though, was they tend to be very financially conservative, and they are slow to take on debt. They, not that they don't ever if they have to, but they're really careful about it. And when they do, that's why it takes so long to make change, because they're like,
Mhm.
okay, we got to make sure this is the right thing to do. Slow to take on debt, very frugal in the way they spend money. They like to own their facilities rather than rent them, which I'm sure a lot of retail businesses now are glad that they're.
Mhm.
I did just talk to one 6 months ago that said, "Boy, I'm sure Granddad made us buy the store back when, so that
Yeah, right.
we don't have to worry about the rent to pay
Oh, for
while the
sure.
store is closed." And the one guy I interviewed, this was several years ago, which you'll tell from the story. He goes, "Yeah, we had somebody from Lehman Brothers come consult with us and told us we didn't have nearly enough leverage, that we really needed to borrow some more money if we wanted to, be successful and start, growing and investing that." He said, "Yeah, we didn't hire him."
Yeah, weird. You don't have enough leverage. And by the way, I get commissioned off of giving you leverage. So I
Yeah,
wonder where that's coming from, right?
yeah. And he goes, "Look what happened to them, and
I-
we're still here."
yeah, exactly.
Um,
Uh, I was going to say, and I don't want to detract too much from what I think is it's super related. I'm just in the middle of this book called Makers and Takers. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was written like 4 years ago, before even a lot of this stuff is unfolded. This woman has described the financialization of business in America. Very interesting, where the short-term profits, the stock buybacks, and this consumption of like where the Century Club companies, they have to provide goods and services that are profitable and have healthy growth
Yeah.
over time.
Over time.
Like, and it's just like proof. You've literally
No,
just
no
proven.
financial tricks, just real
Yeah,
solid
weird,
business.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, Ari DeGoose, who wrote a book that I really like called The Living Company. He was the head of strategy for Royal Dutch Shell for a number of years, a 200-year-old company, if you will. And he has said that most companies don't live as long as they could because they focus exclusively on economic
Mm-hmm.
factors, not realizing that a business is a community of humans, and that that once you realize that, then it's like, okay, what value are we providing to the humans in our community, whether it's employees or customers or vendors or our community.
It's so just to take that even one step further, because I couldn't agree with you more. And you've proven it through your research. And I think there's a lot more material there, like Simon Sinek's new book, The Infinite Game. He talks about private equity short term and that being a disaster for the long term growth of these companies. And so there's other stuff, but you've gotten this baseline of like, hey, it's worked for these companies for 100 years. But my point is to take it a next step further to, which I believe is proof in what you're saying. So I've got 4-year-old twins, Vicky,
Oh boy.
and
You're busy.
yeah, they're both girls. Yeah, I've got my hands full, right? But when you have to describe to a 4.5-year-old what a business is,
Hmm.
and literally, because like it's this idea of this organization that we have in our minds as a species, right? And this goes to a little bit more in the philosophical, but like it's a group of human beings that organize themselves together collectively on a unified vision. And
Mhm.
like there is no like there's people just agreeing that, hey, we're gonna do this together, and then the financials as a result. And that's like how I had to describe it to my kids. It wasn't like I didn't start with there's a spreadsheet with internal rates of return. No, I was like, no, there's a bunch of people that got together and made this phone that you played on, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
yeah. I mean, financials are important. They provide the way to get things done, and they're a result, but they're not the purpose. Yeah.
because someone has to buy your goods or services, and
Yeah.
then you have to deliver them consistently over time. How did you what popped out on how they handled innovation? Because I think about how difficult that is. You mentioned how difficult that was and how they approached it with humbleness, but was there anything that stuck out, that like how they handled crises or innovation?
What struck me as interesting, and again, because it goes so counter to what we might think of it from old companies, is how open the leaders were to really weird ideas, or how they sought people that they could talk to that were in totally different industries, and that they didn't have blinders on.
Mhm.
They were just, I almost say it's not the right analogy, but almost like children in terms of their wonder and awe of the world,
Mhm.
and wanting to learn from other people. And you get unusual for CEOs. You get them in a room and they didn't want to talk about themselves and their company. They wanted to hear about you and what are you doing and what new ideas have you seen, and what's going on in your business, and this and it happened inside the companies as well. Just being very open to employees coming forward with ideas, or as I said, vendors or customers, and instead of saying, oh, we know what we're doing here, don't bother us,
Mhm.
it would be, oh, well, I hadn't thought of that before, kind
Yeah.
of thing. But this kind of willingness to embrace even really off the wall thinking, and not just kind of dismiss it, but being open to it and seeing. I mean, I can remember at Herman Miller when the designer, actually it was a technology that came from a supplier, and then one of our designers worked on it in terms of a chair without any cushions. And even our customers said, no way we're buying a chair without a cushion on it. And we said, well, just, and so over, I think it took 5 years to develop the Aran chair. And now, that's kind of become the standard, right?
Isn't that
But at the
crazy?
time, who would buy a chair without cushions? It just, so I think that, that, and again, it comes back to culture, that it's built into the culture, the curiosity, openness to new ideas, and not being afraid to try new things and even to fail.
Right. And it's so in that makers and takers book. I mean, the polar opposite example of that is this woman talked about how disastrous GM got after like creating this culture of just like, if you brought something up that's bad, I mean, you're just going to get crucified for it. Right. I mean, like you're never going to see that. And that had to do with the ignition recall or something like that. But you just, you're taking it and flipping it hopefully the ideas bubble to the top. You met, in some of your material, you talked about individualism versus stewardship. And like, I don't know if some of this culture or some of these things that we're talking about right now, I tend to, Vicky, like see these as a result of like the ownership structure or how ownership is translating that structure. Because if it's private equity backed or public backed or with a board, all these different things drive down to this Milton Friedman drive shareholder value, right? So like, I believe that there is such a significance of how the structure of ownership and income is separate. So you have the employees and even the family, like you have the separation of like, hey, there's a financial asset here, but then everybody's got incomes. Was there any kind of commonality, or like if you said you kind of had the spectrum of all these different structures, but like, did you see anything that bubbled to the top of like what worked or like what was not?
It was a variety. Even I would say that I think something like 12% of the Century Club companies in the U.S. are public. Many of those are closely held, and the families still on the board, or active in management. So, there's that model. And then there's the owner operator model. Then there's a model where the family maybe still owns it, the company, and is chairman of the board, but they have professional management. We saw many different combinations, and a lot of it, there's all kinds of stories about what happens, as you've said, the third generation, and trying to make it through that transition once family is diffused and you have different ideas of, what should be done. Some of the more successful methods I've seen is where there's a deliberate, family business office, and then a few family members are active managers in the business, but they separate the two. They use the family business office and, maybe twice a year gatherings so that everybody knows what's going on in the business. But then there's a few who are truly interested in running it.
It's like the financial asset of the equity versus and that's what I find so interesting. And like, I was surprised as I was digging into your material, the wide variety of them. It wasn't as obvious as I would have thought. Like, oh yeah, most of them are ESOPs or family held, but you like, it's public and private and this and that. And I can only imagine the families and how much they had to level up their understanding of the finance in order to protect in order to protect the company from active investors or like the other board members that didn't see. The more people that you get involved, the more you had to, align your view. Like there's more and more stakeholders, and it must be so difficult to make sure you're.
And that takes a time investment. And one company that I've worked with that isn't quite 100 years old yet had, significant family division issues along that. And they were so adamant about wanting to keep the company together, not having to go public, that they truly invested in, getting everybody together and really talking through it, working. There's several family business organizations that are really good, I think, at consulting with these organizations and helping them manage through those issues, because it's there's different ways to do it. I don't see that there's any one method, but what I think is required is that there's unanimity around wanting to stay an independent operation. And if you can get there, that says that, survival as an independent entity is what's important to us, then I think, a lot of these other things can be helpful in getting there. But if you don't come to that conclusion, if you say, no, I really want to, just grow to the point where we can sell and get our money out, then you've got some problems.
What's so interesting too, because you're boiling it down to what is everybody in agreement on? Because then every strategy and choice becomes a derivative of what you agreed upon. And like, if you think about what you just said of, we're in agreement that this entity needs to exist. Well, then in order to be super excited about that, you should hopefully have one big mission and purpose statement, right? Because otherwise, why would you get excited about that? Otherwise, it'd just be about the money.
Yeah.
So you kind of it's super interesting how it all kind of falls in like that. You had talked about in some of your stuff, the power of storytelling, which I thought was interesting. So why don't you kind of explain how that fits into the Century Club?
Yeah. So stories are very powerful, I think, in terms of helping understand people as well as companies. And, and especially in transferring culture, and you'll have new employee orientation in these companies is a storytelling process often, because it's not just filling out the forms for insurance and taxes. It's okay, this is the company that you're joining, and this is who we are, and this is how we do things. And so often it's stories about the founder or significant people that help make the company successful, about big successes as well as crises that the company had faced. But it's the process of storytelling that the message becomes so much clearer and more understandable and more memorable, I think. When I was at Herman Miller, the CEO, who was then the son of the founder, would every quarter at the quarterly business meeting, it was all hands on deck, he would start with a story. And then that story made the point that he wanted people to remember or to learn for that period. And then he ended up publishing that all these stories in a book called Leadership as an Art that became a very famous book. But I still remember those stories where, when he introduced the whole idea of every employee would be an owner in the company. And that, he started by talking about a friend of his who was, working on a camp for inner city kids, and took them out into the country. And the first thing that they did was try to play a baseball game, and none of the kids wanted to play outfield. And he was like, what's wrong with you? I don't want to play outfield, And they said, well, there's animals in the woods, and, they might come get us. I don't want to be out there all alone. And so the way he solved it was by having two kids play every outfield position, one to watch the woods and one to field the ball. and he said, and that's what we have at Herman Miller now. We have two people in every position, an owner and a worker, so that everybody, while they're doing their job, they're also able to watch the woods, because, you're both an owner and an employee. And so it was through stories like that concepts just, really stuck in your head. and as a matter of fact, one company, when it gave out awards, longevity awards, once you've been with the company 20 years, you became a storyteller. It was like, okay, now it's your obligation to continue to tell the story to new people so they understand who we are and how we do things. And that realize that could be more powerful than managers telling them that, this is how you have.
Right. It's not in some, plain vanilla corporate doc that they're going to get on a memo on a, yeah, that's awesome. When you think about your research, what is your hopes that, what is your hopes for the research, and what kind of dent do you want to have on the world because of it?
My hope all along was, well, first I wanted to just highlight these companies and how great they are. But what I hoped for was that my students, I mean, and this was at the time when I was still teaching, were mostly interested in entrepreneurship, and they wanted to start a company, or many of them were going to work in family companies that they were part of. And so my hope was that this would provide some guidelines for how to build a good company.
I love it.
That it wasn't just about the financial or economics of business. That if a company has done these things and has been in business for over 100 years, they must be doing something right. So it's a good thing to do
Right.
for your company, but in the process, it's good for employees, it's good for customers, it's good for your suppliers, it's good for your community, it's good for all the stakeholders. And that if we can, my hope was that people starting companies or leading companies today who wanted their organizations to last would take these practices and begin to apply them. And I think that we'll all be better off if we have businesses that operate this way.
I can't thank you enough for the research that you've done, because I think, Vicky, it'll be interesting to see how the next 5 to 10 years unfolds and how your research is used. Because I believe, like I had mentioned, Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, he mentions there's this anecdotal like conversation happening, or these books getting published that I'm watching, like Infinite Game or Conscious Capitalism, Bo Burlingham's like Small Giants, that are kind of proving this, but you are actually using, you proved it with the data with these companies that have already done it. Instead of it being kind of someone's sideline opinion based on their experiences, you've said, hey, here's how to do this. And what I love is that this is helping flip the script, that if you're the, like, and what I said is, like, if you're the greediest human being on the planet, you would do this, which means that humans and all the stakeholders come first, because it generates the profits. Because what's happening is we're watching the current situation destroy profits,
Yeah.
right? Like truly, if you're the most greedy individual and you've provided the research now to support people's opinions that are out there. So the reason I say it'll be interesting to see how the years unfold, because I think there are people are going to have to start referencing your research, because people are caring enough where they have to prove their points now.
Yeah, and it's what I'm particularly proud of is that it's more than just case studies, because when you have small data sets, you can do case studies and you can say, "Oh, that's interesting." But I think with the number of companies that were involved in the research and the statistically significant results, hopefully it does carry some weight.
So two last questions for you. One is, what does the word intentional mean to you?
Intentional,
Yes.
being deliberate.
I love
Um,
it. Straight to the point. I love it. Second question is, if people want to get in touch with you, find your research, find your book, what's the best place for everybody to go?
Well, the book, Lessons from Century Club Companies, is available as an ebook or paperback on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can go online and get it. I have a blog, How 100-Year-Old Companies Survive, that I post to occasionally. I'm always available to answer questions at centuryclubcompanies@gmail.com, or I still have my Hope email.
Yeah.
So tenhaken@hope.edu would work as well.
Vicky, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast, and I appreciate everything you've done.
Well, I appreciate your interest. And as I said, I think the more the word can get out about how to make a good, long lasting company, I think we will all benefit from. So thank you.